Dad, Lisa said suddenly, "We want to visit her grave today. Would you come with us?" They drove to the cemetery in comfortable silence. The autumn leaves crunched under their feet as they walked to Catherine's grave. The sisters had brought their mother's favorite flowers, wild roses and lilies. Standing there together, they were struck by how much had changed since their first visit 6 months ago. Then they had been strangers bound by DNA and grief. Now they were sisters, friends, and partners in continuing their mother's legacy. "Sometimes I wonder," Rose said softly, "if she somehow knew this would happen. All those videos, all that planning." "She knew," Alexander replied, putting an arm around each daughter. "Your mother always said that love finds a way. She made sure it did." They stood there as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grave. In the distance, a church bell rang, its sound careening on the crisp autumn air. "The Foundation's first fundraising gala is next month," Lisa remembered. It would have been her birthday. "Perfect timing," Rose smiled. "We'll celebrate her life by helping others change theirs." Alexander looked at his daughters, so different and yet so alike, both carrying pieces of Catherine in their hearts and faces. The pain of losing her would never completely fade, but it had been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. As they walked back to the car, Lisa and Rose linked arms, their steps naturally falling into sync. Alexander followed, watching them share a joke that made them both laugh in that familiar way that still caught his heart. Back at the studio, they gathered their things to head home. The setting sun painted Catherine's self-portrait in warm golden light, making it seem almost alive. Her smile seemed to hold new meaning now, not just the secret she'd carried, but the hope she'd held for this very future. "Same time tomorrow?" Rose asked, hugging her sister goodbye. "Wouldn't miss it," Lisa replied. "We have those scholarship applications to review." Alexander watched them leave, marveling at how life could change so completely. Catherine's secret, born in pain and sacrifice, had blossomed into something extraordinary: a family united, a legacy honored, and two sisters finding their way home to each other. As he locked up the studio, he whispered what had become his nightly message to Catherine: "They found each other, my love, and they're more amazing than you could have ever dreamed." 6 months after discovering Catherine's hidden laptop, the changes in all their lives were profound. The media storm had come and gone, leaving behind a stronger, more united family than anyone could have imagined. The morning sun streamed through Catherine's studio windows, now transformed into a shared space for both sisters. Lisa's photographs hung beside their mother's paintings, while Rose's scientific awards sat on shelves among Catherine's art supplies. The room had become a perfect blend of all three women's passions. Alexander watched from the doorway as his daughters worked together, preparing for the launch of the Catherine Reed Foundation. Lisa was editing photos for the Foundation's website, while Rose reviewed grant proposals for young single mothers pursuing education in arts and sciences. "Mom would have loved this," Lisa said, looking up from her computer. "Helping other women who might be in the situation she was in." Rose nodded, adjusting her reading glasses, another trait she shared with Catherine. "The applications are incredible. So many talented young mothers who just need a chance." The foundation had been their idea, born during late-night conversations as they got to know each other. They'd wanted to honor their mother's memory while preventing other women from facing the impossible choices she had. Alexander remembered the day they'd told their adoptive parents the truth. Both sets of parents had been shocked but ultimately supportive, especially after watching Catherine's heartfelt video messages to them. Now they were all part of one extended family, gathering regularly for holidays and celebrations. "The first grant ceremony is next week," Rose reminded them, checking her calendar. "The press wants to cover it." "Let them," Alexander said softly. "Your mother's story deserves to be told. It might help others feel less alone." The past months had brought countless discoveries as the sisters grew closer. They'd found they'd both had their mother's laugh, their father's determination, and an uncanny ability to finish each other's sentences. Their differences were just as fascinating. Lisa's artistic chaos complementing Rose's scientific precision, creating a balance Catherine would have loved. Together, they'd gone through their mother's letters and videos, learning about the young woman who had faced such a difficult choice in Paris. They'd cried together, laughed together, and slowly built the relationship their mother had dreamed of. The foundation office, located in the same building as Alexander's company, had become their second home. They decorated it with Catherine's artwork and filled it with both scientific equipment and photography gear, creating a space that celebrated all their passions. "Look what I found," Lisa said, pulling out an old photo album. Inside was a picture of Catherine in Paris, standing in front of an art gallery. "This must have been taken right before." Rose touched the photo gently. "She looks so young, not much younger than we are now." Alexander joined them, looking at the photograph. "She would be so proud of you both, not just for finding each other, but for what you're doing with that discovery." The Foundation's first initiative was a scholarship program for single mothers studying art or science. They'd also established a support network connecting women who were facing similar challenges. It was their way of ensuring that no other mother would have to make the choice Catherine had made alone. "She knew," Rose whispered, watching her mother talk about scientific discovery. "She followed my career." "And my photography," Lisa added, seeing the folder of her exhibitions. "She saw it all." Alexander watched as they explored the laptop together, discovering the depth of their mother's love and preparation. Catherine had known that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. She'd made sure she'd be there to help them through it, even if only through these digital messages. As the day drew to a close, Lisa and Rose copied their mother's files, each taking a piece of her legacy home. The studio, once a place of secrets, had become a bridge between past and present, between mother and daughters, between sisters finding their way to each other. "She really did think of everything," Lisa said softly, looking around the studio with new eyes. Rose nodded, holding the laptop close. "She found a way to be here for all of us even now." Alexander touched Catherine's self-portrait on the wall. In the frozen brushstrokes of paint, he saw not just the artist he'd loved, but the mother who had never stopped loving, planning, and hoping for her daughter's reunion. A week after the sisters' first meeting, Alexander found himself back in Catherine's studio, this time with a different purpose. Years ago, she had insisted on keeping her old laptop, even after upgrading to newer models. "It has all my early sketches," she'd said. Now he wondered if it held more than just art. The laptop was dusty but still worked when he plugged it in. The familiar startup sound brought back memories of Catherine sitting at her desk, working late into the night. He'd often bring her tea, watching her create digital versions of her artwork. After several attempts at guessing her password, he remembered something from her letters. He typed in Paris Spring, followed by the year she'd spent there. The screen came to life, revealing hundreds of folders. Most contained what he expected: sketches, photographs, exhibition plans. But one folder, hidden deep in the system files, was simply labeled Future. Inside, he found dozens of encrypted files, each with a date as its name. Alexander's hands trembled as he opened the first file. It was a video recorded in this very studio. Catherine's face filled the screen, looking exactly as she had the week before her final trip. "If you're watching this," she began, "then something has happened to me before I could tell the truth myself. Alexander, my love, I'm so sorry for keeping this secret from you. But there's more you need to know." He watched, tears streaming down his face, as Catherine explained how she'd been secretly preparing for years to find both her daughters. She'd set up trust funds under false names, gathered information, and planned how to approach them both. "I've recorded messages for different scenarios," she continued. "For when they're found, for their birthdays, for their wedding someday. I couldn't be there in person, but I wanted them to have their mother's voice for the important moments." File after file revealed Catherine's meticulous planning. She'd researched both adoption agencies, tracked changes in adoption laws, even consulted with therapists about the best way to reveal such life-changing information to adult adoptees. One video showed her in tears after seeing Rose at a scientific conference 2 years before her death. "I saw her today," Catherine whispered to the camera. "She was presenting her research. She's brilliant, just like her sister. I almost went up to her, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I can find them both." Alexander paused the playback, overwhelmed. Catherine had been so close to telling him, to finding their daughters. The timing of her accident felt even more cruel now. Further exploration of the laptop revealed more surprises. Catherine had created digital photo albums for both daughters, filling them with pictures from their lives that she'd managed to find online. Rose's scientific publications, Lisa's early photography exhibitions, she documented it all. In another folder, he found letters to the adoptive parents, explaining her actions and expressing gratitude for giving her daughters wonderful lives. She'd thought of everything, prepared for every possibility. The most touching discovery was a series of short video clips she'd recorded for everyday moments. For when you need your mom, one was labeled. For when you achieve something amazing. For when you're feeling lost. For when you fall in love. Alexander spent hours watching Catherine share advice, love, and encouragement with the daughters she never got to know. Her foresight was both heartbreaking and beautiful. She'd found a way to be there for them even after she was gone. One video made him pause. For when they meet each other, it was titled. Catherine's face was radiant as she spoke. My beautiful girls, if you're watching this, you've finally found each other. I dream of this moment so often, seeing you together, watching you discover all the ways you're alike and different. There's so much I want to tell you both. He immediately sent messages to both Lisa and Rose, asking them to come to the studio the next day. This was something they needed to see together. That night, Alexander barely slept. He kept thinking about Catherine working on these videos late at night, planning for a future she wouldn't live to see. Her love for their daughters had been so deep that she'd created this digital legacy to guide them even in her absence. The next morning, when Lisa and Rose arrived at the studio, he showed them what he'd found. They sat together, holding hands as they watched their mother's messages. Catherine's voice filled the studio once again, bringing both tears and laughter as she shared stories, advice, and dreams for their futures. When the videos ended, the three of them sat in silence for a long moment. Then Lisa reached across the table and took Rose's hand. The gesture was simple but profound, a bridge across 24 years of separation. I want to show you something, Lisa said, pulling out her camera. She scrolled through photos from her recent trip, stopping at one of a Buddhist temple. Look at this pattern. It's called the eternal knot. It represents how all things are interconnected, even when they seem separate. Rose studied the image, then looked up with red-rimmed eyes. In quantum physics, we study entangled particles, two particles that remain connected even when separated by vast distances. Maybe we were like that all along. Alexander watched as they continued sharing pieces of their lives, building bridges between their separate worlds. There would be challenges ahead, telling their adoptive parents, dealing with the media, learning how to be sisters after a lifetime apart. But in this moment, he could see Catherine's dream of reunion beginning to take shape. Dad, Lisa said suddenly, turning to him. Thank you for finding us, for bringing us together. Rose nodded in agreement. And thank you for giving us time to know each other before everything else. He understood what she meant. Soon, the world would know that the billionaire's daughter had a twin, that Catherine's secret had finally come to light. But for now, in this private dining room, they were just two young women discovering their shared history, their connection, their truth. As the evening drew to a close, Lisa and Rose exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet again. They hugged goodbye, still somewhat awkward, but with growing familiarity. Alexander watched them leave together, talking animatedly as they walked to the elevator. In their matching profiles, their synchronized gestures, he saw Catherine's spirit living on. She had carried the weight of their separation alone for so long, but now her daughters would carry the gift of their connection together. Back home in Catherine's studio, he placed the box of letters on her desk. They know now, he whispered to her memory. They're together, just like you wanted. And they're beautiful, Catherine. So beautiful. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware that within its midst, a family had been transformed. Two separate streams had joined to form a river, flowing toward a future that Catherine had only dreamed of, but never lived to see. The private dining room at the Grand Plaza Hotel felt too small despite its generous size. Alexander had chosen this location carefully, neutral ground, private, yet with the comfort and elegance both women deserved for this life-changing moment. Lisa arrived first, fresh from her flight from Asia, her camera bag still slung over her shoulder. Dad, you look terrible. Have you been sleeping? She hugged him tightly, smelling of airplane coffee and travel-worn clothes. We should wait for our guest, he said softly, guiding her to a seat. There's something important we need to discuss. When Rose walked in 15 minutes later, the room fell silent. Lisa stood up slowly, her photographer's eye taking in every detail of the woman who could have been her reflection. Rose stopped mid-step, one hand going to her throat as she stared at Lisa. "Please, sit down," Alexander said, his voice gentle but trembling. "There's a story you both need to hear." He started with Catherine's time in Paris, watching their faces as he revealed the truth about their birth, their adoption, their mother's impossible choice. Lisa's hands shook as she looked at the old photographs he brought. Rose sat perfectly still, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "So my parents, they're not." Lisa couldn't finish the sentence. "They are your parents in every way that matters," Alexander assured her. "Just as Rose's parents are hers. Catherine wanted you both to have good lives, loving families." Rose finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Did she ever try to find us?" Alexander pulled out the wooden box containing Catherine's letters. "She never stopped thinking about you both. These letters, she wrote them over the years, keeping them safe in her studio." The sisters, the word felt strange even in his thoughts, read their mother's words together, their heads bent close, unconsciously mirroring each other's posture. Their reactions came in waves: shock, grief, anger, confusion, and something else: wonder. "I have a sister," Lisa said suddenly, looking up at Rose. "A twin sister. All those times I felt like something was missing." Rose nodded, understanding. "I used to dream about having a sister. My parents thought it was because I was an only child, but maybe." Alexander watched as they began to talk, hesitantly at first, then with growing animation. They discovered shared traits. Both were terrible at dancing but loved to try. Both were allergic to strawberries. Both had an inexplicable fear of elevators. "There's more," Alexander said quietly, placing his laptop on the table. "Catherine left something for you both." He opened the video files but stepped away to give them privacy as their mother's face appeared on the screen. Catherine's voice, not heard in this room for 3 years, filled the space with warmth and sorrow. "My darling daughters," she began, "if you're watching this, then you finally know the truth." Alexander went to the window, giving them space to hear their mother's explanation, her apologies, her profound expressions of love. Their sobs mingled with Catherine's recorded voice, creating a symphony of grief and healing. That evening, Alexander sat in Catherine's studio, the DNA results spread out before him. The setting sun cast long shadows across her paintings, and he could almost feel her presence, urging him to do the right thing. He picked up his phone and called Lisa. "Sweetheart, when are you planning to come home?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Actually, Dad, I was thinking of coming back next week. I've got some amazing photos to show you from the temples here." "That's perfect," he said, his throat tight. "There's something important we need to discuss." After hanging up, he walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker to life in the growing darkness. The truth would change everything. For him, for Lisa, for Rose. But Catherine had wanted her daughters to know each other, to understand the impossible choice she'd made as a young woman in Paris. He thought about the USB drive with Catherine's video messages still unwatched. Soon both daughters would hear their mother's voice, explaining in her own words why she had made the choices she had. Would they understand? Would they forgive? Looking at his reflection in the window, Alexander saw the worry lines etched deep in his face. The days ahead would be difficult, filled with tears and questions, shock, and possibly anger. But keeping the truth hidden would be a betrayal of Catherine's final wish. He turned back to his desk and began making notes. The revelation would need to be handled delicately, with professional support available for both women. He would need to protect their privacy from the media, shield them from the inevitable publicity that would come when people realized the billionaire's daughter had a twin. But beneath the logistics and practical concerns, Alexander felt a glimmer of hope. Catherine had carried this burden alone for so many years, but now he could finally help her make things right. Her daughters would know the truth, would know how deeply their mother had loved them both, even when circumstances forced them apart. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a few stars peeked through breaks in the clouds. Somewhere in Asia, Lisa was photographing ancient temples, while across the city, Rose was probably still in her lab, both of them unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Guide me through this, Alexander whispered to Catherine's memory as he began to plan how he would reunite their daughters at last. Getting close to Rose without raising suspicion proved challenging for Alexander. He arranged to visit the research department where she worked, observing her from a distance as she explained her latest project to a group of colleagues. Her passionate gestures and the way she used her hands while speaking, it was pure Catherine. He engineered casual meetings in the company cafeteria, making small talk about her research. Each interaction reinforced his suspicions, from the way she absent-mindedly twisted her necklace while thinking to her habit of tilting her head slightly when listening intently. During one such conversation, Rose mentioned her upcoming presentation at the company's environmental summit. "I'm actually quite nervous about speaking in front of such a large audience," she admitted, unconsciously drawing small circles on her coffee cup with her thumb, Catherine's nervous habit. Alexander saw his opportunity. "Why don't you join me for coffee tomorrow? I could share some presentation tips. I've given quite a few speeches in my time." The next day, in his private office with its panoramic city views, Rose sipped her coffee, black with 1 sugar, just like Catherine. Alexander had carefully placed a tissue box on his desk, and when Rose reached for one to wipe a coffee drop, he had what he needed. The DNA test was arranged through a highly discreet private laboratory. Alexander's hands trembled as he sealed the envelope containing the tissue and a strand of hair from Catherine's old hairbrush. The wait would be excruciating, but he needed scientific certainty before proceeding. During those tense days of waiting, Alexander threw himself into work, but his mind constantly wandered to the 2 video files waiting on the USB drive. He still couldn't bring himself to watch them, knowing they were Catherine's final messages to her daughters. Those words weren't meant for his ears, not yet. He found himself looking more closely at photos of Lisa, his daughter with Catherine. Now 24, she was traveling in Asia, documenting traditional art forms for her photography blog. Had Catherine seen traces of Rose in Lisa's features? Had she ached every time she looked at one daughter, knowing another was out there somewhere? The DNA results arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Alexander closed his office door, drew the blinds, and opened the envelope with shaking hands. The clinical language of the report confirmed what his heart had already known. Rose and Lisa were identical twins, sharing the same maternal DNA markers. He sat in silence for a long time, letting the reality sink in. The daughters Catherine had carried beneath her heart were now grown women living completely separate lives, unknowing sisters with their mother's creative spirit split between them, Lisa's art, Rose's science. But knowing the truth and deciding what to do with it were entirely different matters. His private investigator had also uncovered information about the second adoption. Lisa had been adopted through a different agency by a young American couple who were art professors. They'd moved back to the States when she was just a baby. The weight of this knowledge felt almost unbearable. How would Lisa react to learning she was adopted? How would Rose handle discovering her connection to the company's owner? Both women had built their own lives, their own identities. Did he have the right to shatter their understanding of who they were? But Catherine never returned from Milan. The plane carrying her and several other art collectors had crashed in the Alps. She'd taken her secret with her, or so she'd thought. Among the letters, Alexander found a small USB drive. His hands shook as he plugged it into his laptop. The drive contained a folder labeled "For Both My Daughters" with 2 video files inside. He couldn't bring himself to watch them yet. They deserved to be seen first by the daughters they were meant for. He sat back against the wall, surrounded by the pieces of Catherine's hidden life. The setting sun streamed through the studio windows, illuminating her paintings in a new light. He noticed details he'd never seen before. In one of her abstract pieces, 2 intertwined figures reached for each other through a veil of blue. In another, a split tree grew from a single root, its branches stretching in opposite directions but still connected at their core. The truth of Catherine's art was finally clear. She'd been telling her story all along, painting her pain and love onto every canvas. Her studio wasn't just a workspace, it was a sanctuary where she could be close to both her daughters through her letters and her art. Alexander carefully returned the letters to their box, each one a precious testament to Catherine's love. The weight of her secret felt heavy in his hands, but also somehow lighter now that it was shared. He understood now why she'd kept this space so private, why she'd spent so many hours alone here. Looking around the studio as night fell, Alexander made a decision. The renovation would continue, but with a new purpose. This room would no longer be just a memorial to Catherine's art. It would become a place where her daughters could discover their mother's love for them, expressed in paint and words she'd never had the chance to say in person. He placed the box on Catherine's desk next to a self-portrait she painted in Paris. In it, she looked young and uncertain, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. Even then, she'd been telling her truth through her art, waiting for someone to finally understand. "I'll find her," he promised Catherine's painted eyes. "I'll find them both, and I'll make sure they know how much their mother loved them." The renovation of Catherine's art studio wasn't Alexander's idea. His housekeeper had gently suggested that after 3 years, perhaps it was time to preserve Catherine's work properly. He'd resisted at first, but finally agreed to have climate control installed to protect her paintings. He stood in the doorway watching the workers carefully move easels and canvases. Every item they touched made his heart clench, but he knew Catherine would have wanted her art preserved. As the last worker carried out a stack of empty frames, something caught Alexander's eye. A slight unevenness in the antique wooden flooring beneath where Catherine's favorite chair had stood. After everyone left, he knelt down to examine it. His fingers found a small groove, and with gentle pressure, a section of the floorboard lifted. Inside was an ornate wooden box he'd never seen before, its surface dusty but the brass lock still gleaming. The key wasn't in the hiding place, but Alexander recognized the box's style. Catherine had bought similar antiques from a specific shop in Paris. The memory of finding out about her time in Paris was still fresh, making his hands tremble as he held the box. It took 3 days to have a replica key made. When he finally opened the box, the scent of old paper and Catherine's favorite perfume wafted out. Inside were dozens of letters, all in Catherine's distinctive handwriting, addressed simply to "my other daughter." Alexander sat on the studio floor, surrounded by Catherine's paintings, and began to read. "My dearest girl, another birthday has passed, your 5th. I wonder if you love chocolate cake like your sister does. Do you also scrunch your nose when you laugh? There's so much I wonder about you." Letter after letter revealed Catherine's hidden world of grief and love. She'd written to her unknown daughter regularly, documenting thoughts, hopes, and regrets she'd never shared with anyone else. The letters spanned years, from just after the adoption until shortly before her death. One letter, dated from their 3rd year of marriage, made Alexander pause. "My precious daughter, today, your father, though he doesn't know he is your father, talked about wanting children. The guilt of my secret weighs heavier each day. He's such a good man, and I know he would have moved heaven and earth to help me keep you both if he'd known me back then. But I was young, scared, and alone in Paris. The choice I made haunts me, even though I know your adoptive family is giving you a wonderful life." Alexander had to stop reading several times, overwhelmed by the depth of Catherine's hidden pain. In one letter, she described seeing a mother with twin girls at a park and having to leave a charity event because the sight had brought her to tears. In another, she wrote about almost hiring investigators to find her daughter, but stopping out of fear of disrupting the child's life. The most recent letter was dated just weeks before the accident that took Catherine's life. "My darling, I've made a decision. Life is too short to live with regrets. Once I return from my gallery opening in Milan, I'm going to tell Alexander everything. Then, if you're willing, I want to find you. Your sister deserves to know about you, and you deserve to know about your family. I hope you can forgive me for waiting so long." He found himself looking at old videos of Catherine, searching for clues he might have missed. In one clip from their 10th anniversary party, she was listening to a guest talk about her twin grandchildren. Catherine's smile remained fixed, but Alexander could now see the pain in her eyes, the way her hands clutched her champagne glass just a little too tightly. That evening, he sat in his study with a glass of whiskey, looking at side-by-side photos of Catherine and Rose on his computer screen. The resemblance was undeniable. But if Rose was one twin, what had happened to the other? The missing piece of this puzzle could change everything. His phone buzzed with a message from James. "Found something about the second adoption. Meeting tomorrow." Alexander barely slept that night. His dreams were filled with Catherine's voice, trying to tell him something he couldn't quite hear. He woke up thinking about all the times she'd started to say something serious, only to change the subject with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Morning found him standing in front of Catherine's portrait in the living room. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered to her image. "We could have faced this together." The truth was unfolding like a complex origami, revealing new angles with each fold. Alexander knew that uncovering the rest of this story would change many lives, his own, Rose's, and whoever that second baby had grown up to be. But he owed it to Catherine's memory to bring everything into the light. As he prepared to meet James again, Alexander touched his wedding ring, a habit he'd never broken since Catherine's death. "I'll make this right," he promised quietly. "Whatever it takes, I'll find the truth." The morning after the gala, Alexander couldn't focus on anything else. His normally organized mind was scattered, filled with questions about Rose Mitchell and her possible connection to Catherine. After sending his executive team an email postponing his meetings, he sat in his home office, surrounded by old photo albums and his laptop. He started with what he knew. Rose was adopted, grew up in California, and was now a brilliant scientist. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, which meant she would have been born around the time Catherine was in Paris. The timing was too perfect to ignore. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number of James Parker, a private investigator he'd worked with before. "I need everything you can find on Dr. Rose Mitchell," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "And I mean everything. Birth records, adoption papers, anything from her past." While waiting for the investigators' findings, Alexander immersed himself in memories of Catherine. He opened their wedding album, touching the photos gently. Catherine had been radiant that day, but there had always been a shadow in her eyes when certain topics came up, especially about her time before they met. "I was a different person then," she'd once said during a late-night conversation. At the time, he'd assumed she meant she was younger, less mature. Now those words carried new weight. 3 days later, James called back. "You'll want to see this in person," he said, his voice serious. An hour later, Alexander sat in James's modest office, staring at a thick folder. "The adoption was closed," James explained, spreading out documents on his desk. "But I found something interesting. Dr. Mitchell was adopted through an agency in Paris that closed down 15 years ago. The timing matches when your wife was there." Alexander's heart pounded as he read through the paperwork. Rose had been born at a small hospital in Paris's 15th arrondissement. The birth mother's name had been redacted, but one detail jumped out: there had been 2 babies. Twins. Alexander whispered, his mouth dry. "There were twins." James nodded grimly. "The records show 2 baby girls were born that day. One was adopted by the Mitchells from California. The other—" He paused, shuffling through more papers. "The other baby's records are missing, but there's a notation about a private adoption arranged through a different agency." The room seemed to spin. Alexander remembered Catherine's strange reaction whenever they saw twins in public, how she would go quiet and distant. He'd attributed it to her wanting children of her own, never suspecting there might be a deeper reason. More details emerged as they dug deeper. The Mitchells had been told the birth mother was a young art student who couldn't care for twins. They never knew her name or saw her face. The adoption had been handled through an intermediary who was now deceased. "There's more," James said softly. "I found this." He slid across a photocopy of an old newspaper clipping from a Paris local paper. The grainy image showed a young woman painting at an easel, her face partially hidden but unmistakably Catherine. The caption mentioned an art student's exhibition at the Sorbonne. Alexander stared at the date, exactly 9 months before Rose's birth. His hands shook as he picked up the clipping. Catherine had been so young then, barely 20. She must have been terrified, alone in a foreign country, facing an impossible choice. But why hadn't she ever told him? They had built a life together, achieved success beyond their dreams. They could have searched for the children together, provided for them both. The weight of her secret must have been unbearable. Back at home, Alexander spent hours in Catherine's old art studio, which he preserved exactly as she'd left it. Every brush stroke on her canvases seemed to hold new meaning now. He noticed details he'd overlooked before. How many of her paintings featured pairs of objects: 2 birds, 2 trees, 2 dancers. Had she been expressing her hidden grief through her art all along? Near the end of the evening, he overheard Rose talking about growing up in California with her adoptive parents. The word adoptive hit him like a physical blow. His hands began to shake as possibilities he'd never considered started forming in his mind. Catherine had spent a year in Paris before they met, studying art at the Sorbonne. She had always been vague about that time, changing the subject whenever it came up. Alexander had respected her privacy, assuming it had been a difficult period she preferred not to discuss. Now he wondered what secrets that year in Paris might have held. As the gala wound down, Alexander watched Rose say her goodbyes. She moved through the crowd with grace, but there was something vulnerable in her expression when she thought no one was watching. It reminded him of the look he'd sometimes caught on Catherine's face when she was lost in thought, staring at old photographs. That night, as his driver took him home, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about the evening's events. His mansion felt emptier than usual, filled with memories of Catherine and now questions about Rose. He went to his study and opened his laptop, determined to find answers. Whatever connection existed between Rose and Catherine, he would uncover it. He owed it to Catherine's memory, to Rose, and to himself to understand the truth. As he began his search, Alexander had no idea that this chance encounter would unravel a secret that would change not just his life, but many others as well. Looking out his study window at the city lights below, he made a silent promise to Catherine. If Rose was somehow connected to her past, he would find out how. And this time, he wouldn't let any truths remain hidden in the shadows. The evening air sparkled with possibility at the Grand Plaza Hotel, where Alexander Reed's annual tech charity gala was in full swing. The billionaire stood near the champagne fountain, barely listening to a group of investors discussing their latest ventures. At 45, he had built his company from scratch, but tonight his mind wasn't on business at all. His world shifted the moment he saw her across the crowded ballroom. The crystal glasses in his hand nearly slipped through his fingers. The young woman wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair falling in gentle waves past her shoulders. But it wasn't her elegance that made his heart stop, it was her face. She looked exactly like his late wife, Catherine. Alexander blinked hard, wondering if the stress of running a global tech empire had finally caught up with him. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same high cheekbones, the slight tilt of her eyes, even the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. It was as if Catherine had somehow walked back into his life, only 20 years younger. "Mr. Reed, are you feeling all right?" his assistant asked, noticing his pale complexion. "Who is she?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "The woman in the blue dress, talking to Dr. Thompson." His assistant quickly checked her tablet. "That's Dr. Rose Mitchell. She's one of our new research scientists from the biotech division. Brilliant mind, they say. She's presenting her work on sustainable energy solutions tomorrow." Alexander watched as Rose laughed at something her colleague said. The sound carried across the room, and his chest tightened. Catherine had laughed exactly the same way. A genuine melodious sound that always made others smile too. He made his way through the crowd, stopping to shake hands and exchange pleasantries, but his eyes never left Rose. As he got closer, he could see the small differences. Rose's features were slightly sharper, her stance more reserved than Catherine's confident poise had been. But the similarities were still striking enough to make him question everything he thought he knew. Finally, he reached their group. Dr. Thompson brightened. "Ah, Mr. Reed. I was just telling Dr. Mitchell about our plans for the new research facility." Rose turned to face him, and Alexander felt the air leave his lungs. Up close, the resemblance was even more remarkable. She extended her hand with a polite smile. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Reed. Your work in renewable energy technology is inspiring." Her voice was different from Catherine's, softer, with a slight accent he couldn't place. But when their eyes met, he saw the same warmth, the same intelligence that had made him fall in love with his wife 15 years ago. "The honor is mine," he managed to say, his voice steadier than he felt. "I've heard impressive things about your research." They talked about her work, but Alexander's mind was racing. Catherine had never mentioned any relatives who could explain this uncanny resemblance. She'd grown up in foster care, or at least that's what she told him. But looking at Rose now, he knew there had to be more to the story. The conversation flowed naturally, but Alexander noticed something else that sent chills down his spine. Rose had the same habit of drawing small circles with her thumb when she was deep in thought, exactly like Catherine used to do. It wasn't the kind of trait that could be copied. It was too subtle, too unconscious. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself watching Rose interact with others. She had Catherine's compassion, stopping to help when one of the waiters dropped a tray, making sure he wouldn't get in trouble. She showed the same enthusiasm when discussing scientific breakthroughs, her eyes lighting up just like Catherine's had whenever she talked about her art. The similarities were too many to be coincidental. Alexander felt like he was putting together a puzzle without having all the pieces. Catherine had passed away 3 years ago in a car accident, taking with her all the answers to questions he hadn't known to ask. Now, watching Rose, he had so many questions he could barely think straight.